Well, I must say I'm very pleased and honored to be here. I'm also a bit surprised because I'm not a diplomat. I spent my career at the World Bank, which is not noted for its diplomatic skills, cultural or otherwise. But on reflection, let me also say it's a privilege really to follow Professor Katamuri because I was posted in India well before all of you, and she was born in 66 and 67 when India was in the grip of famine. And I was involved in this whole green revolution process, which has made India an exporter. I mean, India is now a major player globally. And I am now at the King's College International Development Institute, as well as in the Department of Political Economy. And we are focusing on emerging market countries. And India, of course, we also have an India Institute at King's College. So I think, learning from India is very, very interesting and very critical. So I really enjoyed hearing Professor Katamuri. And I also thought that she highlighted international development in a sense. And I would say that both international development and the evaluation disciplines, that I am an evaluator, I'm teaching evaluation at King's College, are driven by the same aspirations that animate cultural diplomacy. A similar vision was embedded in the programs that Senator Fulbright created. And I was a beneficiary of a Fulbright scholarship, which got me into development. That's when I joined the World Bank. And under Bob McNamara's leadership, independent evaluation of development was pioneered. Now, what does all this have to do with cultural diplomacy? Well, Senator Fulbright was convinced that the security benefits, quite apart from the human well-being benefits, the security benefit of connecting young people across borders would be a multiple of their modest costs. He estimated his entire program in perpetuity would be the cost of a single nuclear submarine and would have much more security benefits than a nuclear submarine. So this romantic notion that emerged really from the ashes of World War II. This was a time of optimism, faith in government action, public support for international cooperation, this notion that the problems of others. I mean, that's why development was invented, really, right after the Second World War. There was no such notion before that. And an evaluation discipline came out at about the same time. So cultural diplomacy springs from the same logic, that global problems demand global solutions, and that they cannot be solved through hard power alone. Hunger, disease, pollution, climate change, which was mentioned, financial stability, regional conflict, international crime, terrorism, do not respect national borders. Nor can these threats to human security be fought without systematic application of knowledge and experience from all over the world, transmitted through cultural diplomacy, and capturing this knowledge in a rigorous way is what evaluation is all about. So there is a link between what I do and cultural diplomacy, and I was surprised that Mark noticed it and invited me. Now, the ability to practice diplomacy has always been a defining characteristic of statehood. Cultural diplomacy is in fact in line with a long historical tradition. Since ancient Greece, sent trusted envoys, precious gifts, confidence-building measures in order to diffuse tension, to cement trade relationships, and to consolidate alliances. So, cultural diplomacy has a long pedigree, but diplomacy has not stood still. It has had to adapt to globalization and to democratization. I remember, in the 60s, when I started in this business, the elites were generating foreign policy. Now, really, the people themselves are very much influencing foreign policy. The advent of social networks, the new information technology have reduced the influence of elites So that decision-making at that level is maybe the defining characteristic of modern diplomacy. Is the information revolution, which has created this integrated world in which public perceptions of value, and value is part of evaluation, matter, so that bilateral public diplomacy is gradually ceding ground to inclusive and multilateral forms of cultural diplomacy. So soft power through exchange of ideas, information, literature, art, and so on, and other aspects of culture among nations and their peoples has come to the center of the international relations stage now. And the theme of this conference is, of course, international cooperation across 6 continents is absolutely spot on. Cultural diplomacy recognizes the value of social resilience, cultural diversity, and mutual understanding across borders. So it points to a new phase of international relations, and when the limits of government-to-government interaction, bilateral, and the spaghetti ball, in a way, of international conventions that they generate are finally acknowledged. So Kofi Annan wisely said, ours is a world in which no individual and no country exists in isolation. All of us live simultaneously in our own communities and in the world at large. Professor Katamori highlighted this, as Amartya Sen said, we all have diverse identities. Richard Haas said, we are all multilateralists now, or at least we need to be. In other words, policy coherence across nations and joined up international action have come to the center stage of international relations. International public opinion matters, and this is why cultural diplomacy has come into its own. Now, what then is likely to be a dominant preoccupation of the international civil society today? I will argue that it is inequality. And the stubborn fact is that income inequality has been growing at an exponential rate recently, and that publics around the world are taking note. In OECD countries, we have seen over the last 3 years, or at least since the financial crisis, more inequality has been created than the previous 12 years. Emerging market economies have faced similar challenges. Inequality is growing anywhere, everywhere. And if you look at public opinion, there is a Pew Charitable Trust poll which found that clear majorities in all over the world, whether it's in Americas, Europe, Asia Pacific, Middle East, Africa, clear majorities perceive the wealth gap in their country to have gotten worse over the past 5 years, and that the gap between the rich and the poor is a very big problem in their societies. This is particularly true in developing economies where about 75% see inequality as a major issue. So this, and among advanced economies, this frustration is particularly intense, obviously in Southern Europe, in the Rim. More generally, large people around the world believe the economic deck is stacked against them. Some numbers, the 2000 crisis brought to light the fact that the current economic system breeds insecurity, inefficiency, as well as unjustified wealth disparities. A year ago, there were only 1,200 billionaires, okay? They have a combined fortune of $4.5 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars. Now this is over half of the net worth of 3 billion people. I mean, it's crazy. In other words, the richest 0.5% of the world's population, 0.5%, hold over well a third of the world's wealth, while 68% of the people all over the world share 4% of the world's wealth. 40% of the world's wealth is owned by 1% of the population. The poorest half own only 1%. I mean, and these numbers are new in a sense. I mean, it has not always been that way. Now, global inequality has declined slightly because of the rapid growth of the large emerging market economies. But income inequality within countries has grown relentlessly in rich and poor countries. In India, the number of malnourished children is nearly 50%. It has remained at this level between 1996 and 2008, while billionaires increased their share of national income from 1% in 1996 to 22%. The billionaires in India now have 22% of the wealth of the national income, according to recent statistics. So this said, while within countries inequality is an issue, it's globally, essentially, international development remains a priority. If you're concerned with global equality, then development cooperation remains critical. The challenge is huge. I mean, the average per capita income in developed countries is 7 times that prevalent in the average developing country. The average citizen in Luxembourg, 62 times more income than the average Nigerian citizen. Child mortality is 18 times higher in Mali than in the US. The average OECD person has 13 years of schooling compared to less than 6 in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, these glaring inequalities, combined with the economic crisis, have shaken complacency among voters, policymakers, and academics. Public perceptions have changed, and there is no turning back. We heard about, the clamor of the Arab Spring, labor unrest in African mining communities, Occupy Wall Street protests. They bring out the fact that the current situation where a few individuals can accumulate enormous wealth while depriving large segments of the population of basic necessity have created a lot of anger and resentment. I mean, it's not the fact, inequality which is due to effort, skill, or entrepreneurship is one thing. This is generally accepted. What is not accepted is public indignation spreads and social cohesion is undermined when distorted rules of the game, predatory behavior, unethical practices are richly rewarded. I mean, the issue of corruption is a big one in rich and poor countries alike. Now, this means that we are living today, we have a moment in history today where fundamental societal change may be in the offing, but nobody knows where this is going to go. There is no compelling political vision capable of bringing together scattered interests, ideas, and energies as yet. We don't have a vision of how things could be made differently in the new international system. In the interim, uncertainty prevails and risks are very high. International tensions are rising, and another financial upheaval cannot, unfortunately, be ruled out, particularly in Europe, which opens a window of opportunity, really, for cultural diplomacy to engage more critically and independently with the antecedents and effects of inequality in societies. So, to me, one of the tasks facing cultural diplomats is to mobilize public support for principled policymaking, which in a context which has been hobbled by the disproportionate influence of powerful lobbies and vested interests. Cultural diplomats are being called upon to make a difference to societies around the world. Now, the United Kingdom is one of the few rich countries that remains committed to increasing the resources going into the development enterprise. But generally, aid pessimism is rising everywhere, and my professional evaluation is becoming more and more rigorous, and rightly so to some extent, as far as the aid enterprise is concerned. But we should not cloud the remarkable achievements of development since the Second World War. When this view of turning swords into plowshares, where development ideas took shape and evaluation emerged as this distinct discipline. It took the United Kingdom 60 years to double output per person. Turkey did it not in 60 years, in 20 years. Brazil in 18 years. China in 10 years. 13 developing countries have grown for 25 years at more than 7% a year. At this rate, incomes double every decade. And this is what has been happening, in India, China, and Brazil, and other places. This has been the engine of the global economy, is no longer in OECD countries, it's in the developing world. Now, of course, the development picture is a mixed bag, but in the aggregate, social indicators have been remarkably improved. The Millennium Development Goal of cutting by half the share of people who have no access to clean water has been reached. The world has achieved parity in primary school education between girls and boys, which was a focus of the Millennium Development Goals. We have already achieved the target of reducing global poverty by half between 1990 and 2015. This goal has been reached already. And the decline in the share of poverty has been sustained, which means that we have gradual economic convergence now between the emerging market countries and the advanced countries. Now, this said, inequality has detracted from these remarkable gains, and it has slowed advances in key areas. We have still unequal distribution of performance across regions and countries. We still have a major hunger problem. 1 billion people are going to bed hungry every night still. Decreases in maternal mortality are off track. We have not been able to achieve the stretch target of universal access to HIV treatment. Unemployment and underemployment remain very high. The slum population continues to grow globally. Out of 5 billion people in developing countries, we still have 2.5 billion living on less than $2 a day, imagine. And 1.3 billion in abject poverty, less than $1.25 a day. So development progress and social equity trends have been particularly disappointing in 48 countries, which are called the least developed countries. And only 3 of them have graduated from that status since the late 60s. So we have the bottom billion that Paul Collier talks about is finding solutions to their predicament is the most intractable development challenge. Development assistance must continue to deal with this issue. So, so much for this overview of the development performance and the development challenges. What does it portend for cultural diplomacy? Well, first and foremost, inequality, whether it's global inequality among countries or global or national inequality, raises fundamental questions about civic virtues and moral values, which in a way is at the core of cultural diplomacy. These disparities in the quality of livelihoods violate a basic sense of justice. The perpetuation of inequality through the blunt exercise of power undermines social stability. Johann Galtung equates inequality with structural violence. He's saying, since it's avoidable, since it impairs fundamental human rights, and since it causes premature death and disability, it is violence. Diplomats have been reluctant to engage broadly and critically with the ethical issues that inequality entails. There are, of course, notable exceptions, including the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, has set up this Born Equal initiative, which I think is very, very important because it supports a diverse range of activity to promote equality at different levels in different regions of the world. Now, the rationale for focusing on inequality is very, very strong. If you look at moral philosophers like John Rawls, he says justice is the first virtue of social institution. Religious thinking links justice to divine judgment even. Socratic philosophy defines justice as a state of harmonious and proper relationships among diverse parts of the society, which means diverse classes, and therefore more equality promotes harmony, social harmony. Naturalists view justice as part of natural law, and so on. And egalitarians argue that freedom and justice are hollow without equality, and the French have liberty, equality, and fraternity. So engaging critically with the ethical dimension of this issue in public life, restoring the preeminence of values and supporting democratic debate are basic prerequisites for an ethical approach to cultural diplomacy, in my view. Now, there is this notion that if you have economic development, you must have more inequality. This is a very widespread notion. There's something called the Kuznets curve, which means that as development inequality goes up, and then through the magic of the market, inequality comes back down. This is a very appealing view. The story goes as follows. I mean, it's really trying to interpret what happened during the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom between 1750 and 1850. The idea is that through innovation, thrift, risk-taking by private entrepreneurs, a lot of wealth was created, labor markets tightened, and gradually income increased. And trickle-down benefits worked, inequality decreased. And so this is how, kind of neoliberal economists look at development, that inequality is, a sad but necessary component of economic development. And, this is a plausible theory, but it's wrong. I mean, the theory, because, further research has shown that what really happened in the birth of the welfare state is that it's public pressures which have created market-free public education, strengthened trade unions, progressive taxation, social welfare programs, and this is what led to the decrease in inequality following the Industrial Revolution. So policy matters, and this has implication for it seems to me, for cultural diplomacy, that cultural diplomacy should promote social policies. There is no inevitable correlation between economic growth and inequality. What inequality is influenced by is a number of things based on research. First of all, land distribution patterns. Land reform has been a very important element in the progress of many Asian countries. Heavy reliance on extractive industries has led to concentration of wealth and official corruption. And so on. Monopolies have increased inequality and have involved social cost. Rent-seeking corruption have fed inequality. If children are denied education, poor children are denied education, the returns to education fall. If you have discrimination in credits or land markets, resources do not flow where the returns are highest. Poorly designed privatization has been a major source of increased inequality. And we know from research that extreme inequality induces illegal activities as well as social instability. Now, what is not measured does not get done, and that is why cultural diplomacy should embrace new metrics as we look at the progress of countries. GNP still dominates, and yet it's not a satisfactory indicator of social progress. It fails to capture highly valuable services provided within the household. Most of all, it fails to account for environmental destruction, and it reflects the inequity. It does not also reflect inequality at all. So you may have rapid growth. Take the Ivory Coast. We thought it was a great success, and it collapsed because of essentially regional inequality, which led to a civil war. Now, if you look at the now whole industry of happiness economics or surveys of life satisfaction, if you look at those data, you will also find that very robust results about the relationship between income and happiness. In other words, as income grows, you get diminishing returns. More money is very important to meet basic needs, but after a certain level, more money does not lead to more happiness. Relative incomes matter more than absolute incomes. So greater equality generates higher well-being, both because of positional effects and a result of what appears to be a general distaste for social inequality among people. Now, Amartya Sen has defined development as a freedom to realize human capabilities way beyond income. And here I have put on a matrix and no time to go through it. We need to develop new metrics which take account of poverty, not only in terms of material well-being, but also of relational well-being and perceptual well-being. quality of life, and health or social health in local communities, and things of that kind. So, what I would like to now talk about is what explains the rise in global inequality, or the persistence of global inequality. What has happened is a chronic reliance on debt-driven economic expansion in developed countries, accompanied by macroeconomic imbalances between rich and poor countries. Essentially, what has happened, the rich countries of the world have purchased goods and services produced by poor countries by borrowing from the poor countries. In other words, we're buying Chinese goods with Chinese money. I mean, it's a wonderful system, isn't it? And the reason it's happening is because developing countries have to build their reserves up in order to avoid instability. As you see now, emerging markets, bonds and so on are really, the yields are way up. So in order to protect themselves from the volatility of this global system, they have to build reserve, which means they have to buy dollars. And therefore, the United States and other OECD countries are relying on developing countries' money to buy the developing countries' goods. Now, this cannot last. At some point, we are going to have a rebalancing of the global economy, and whether it's going to be another crisis or it will happen gradually remains to be seen. But what has happened is that this has reduced the returns to labor in rich countries because of outsourcing, and that's how inequality has gone up in rich countries. But it has created employment in developing countries, to be sure, but it has also prevented governments from raising taxes because of all these fiscal paradises and so on. So we have a global system which has essentially favored capital at the expense of labor, since labor is not mobile and migration is severely restricted. And this is, I think, what has underlies, plus the monopoly power of the big information companies, has led to where we are today. So global reform is essential. And which also means that aid is no longer what it used to be. Aid used to be the major transmission belt between rich and poor countries. Now it has become a relatively minor aspect of this. Exports are 45 times the level of official aid flows, 45 times. Remittances, 2.2 times. Foreign direct investment, oops, what happened? So foreign direct investment, 4.6 times. Royalty and license fees, which is intellectual property, is about a fourth of aid flows. So, and of course, this doesn't count climate change, the cost of climate change on poor countries. Now, the rich countries should deliver what they promised. Under the Millennium Development Goals, there was Goal 8, which said that there should be more ODA, more development assistance. There should be an open, rule-based, predictable, non-discriminatory trading and financial system, and debt reduction in developing countries, highly indebted ones, access to affordable essential medicines, and so on. But progress towards all these objectives has been very, very limited. Whereas developing countries are more or less, by and large, particularly the emerging markets, have more or less achieved what they were supposed to do in terms of development. We are half of where we ought to be in terms of official aid flows. We are 0.3% of national income instead of 0.7%. The Doha Development Round is gridlocked. And this is really tragic for developing countries because this trade restriction on labor-intensive manufacturers and agricultural products are very much the reason of the poverty of many of these countries. So it is time for cultural diplomacy to create a climate of opinion that make progress towards the reform of these policies towards global equality feasible. This would be in the interest of all. And within countries, national policy should also evolve because we now know that equal society are more secure and healthier unequal societies endure more violence and social unrest than equal societies. There was a lot of evidence, quantitative evidence to that effect. The correlation between life expectancy and per capita incomes is much weaker than the correlation between life expectancy and equality. Professor Katamori was mentioning earlier that Scotland and London have different per capita income. It's also true that their health situation is drastically different. In general, on all measures of human well-being, the top 20% are at least 3 times better off than the bottom 20%. National happiness indicators are strongly correlated with equality. Social mobility is hindered by inequality, and the discrimination underlies it. Even such basic values as trust in society, which are very important for effective economic management, are affected by that. So therefore, not just the poor benefit from more equality. Even the rich are happier in equal societies. Since inequality favors status competition, insecurity, low self-esteem, and consumerism, I think the pursuit of happiness is fully compatible with greater equality. Cultural diplomacy has long embraced freedom. It is time to give the same priority to the pursuit of equality. Thank you very much.